You are not needed in this company anymore. Your contributions are no longer appreciated. And
There is a building in downtown Chicago. Glass, steel, 42 floors of corporate power. And if those walls could talk, they would tell you about a Tuesday morning in October of 2009, when a 54-year-old man named Robert Hayes walked out of those front doors carrying a cardboard box, while the people he had given 22 years of his life to stood at the windows above and watched him go. Some of them looked away. Some of them didn't. And one of them, a man Robert had personally trained, mentored, and defended in 3 separate performance reviews, smiled. They had told him, in that conference room on the 31st floor, that he was no longer a fit for the company's direction, that his contributions, while appreciated, were no longer aligned with where the organization was heading. Corporate language, carefully chosen, designed to say everything and nothing at the same time. But what they meant, what the room made perfectly clear, was this: you are done, Robert. You are finished. You are nobody. 15 years later, Robert Hayes pulled up to that same building in a black SUV, walked through those same front doors, took the elevator to the 31st floor, sat down at the head of the conference table, and slid a cashier's check across the surface for the full purchase price of the entire property. He owned it. Every floor, every window, every corner office where someone had once decided his life didn't matter. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, I need you to stay with me through this entire story, because what happened between that October morning in 2009 and the day Robert came back is not the kind of story that moves in a straight line. It is the kind of story that breaks a man down to nothing and then shows you exactly what nothing can become when the right man refuses to accept it. Robert Hayes grew up in Rockford, Illinois. His father, James Hayes, worked 31 years on the floor of a manufacturing plant and came home every night smelling like machine oil and quiet exhaustion. His mother, Dorothy, cleaned office buildings on the north side of Chicago, buildings not entirely unlike the one that would eventually fire her son. They were not a wealthy family. They were not a connected family. What they were was a working family, and in the Hayes household, that meant something. You showed up. You did your work. You kept your word. You earned what you had. Robert was the first person in his family to attend a 4-year university. He worked nights at a grocery warehouse, wore the same pair of dress shoes to every class because they were the only pair he owned, and graduated with a degree in business administration in 1983. He was not the loudest man in his graduating class. He was not the most charismatic. But his professors remembered him for one thing consistently: his ability to see solutions where other people saw problems. He got his first job at a mid-sized logistics firm on the outskirts of Chicago, entry-level, answering phones and filing contracts. He was $32 a week above minimum wage, and he treated that job like it was the most important work being done in America. Within 3 years, he had been promoted twice. Within 7, he was managing a department of 42 people. And when Hartwell Grayson Incorporated, one of the largest supply chain management companies in the Midwest, came to him with an offer in 1991, Robert Hayes said yes. He believed he was walking into the opportunity of his life. And for a while, that belief was justified. For nearly 2 decades, Robert delivered. His division grew revenue by 38% in the first 5 years. He built systems that the company still used long after he was gone. He developed talent, young professionals who came to him uncertain and left him capable. He worked late. He worked weekends. He traveled when his children were in school plays and missed dinners he could never get back. He gave Hartwell Grayson everything a man has to give, and for a long time, Hartwell Grayson rewarded him for it. But corporations are not families, no matter how many times a CEO uses that word in an all-hands meeting. Corporations are ecosystems, and ecosystems have politics. And politics, at the executive level of a company like Hartwell Grayson, had very little to do with who was doing the best work and everything to do with who was aligned with the right people at the right time. In 2007, the company brought in a new chief operating officer, a man named Philip Draper. Young, polished, the kind of man who wore his confidence like a tailored suit and had never once in his career been told he wasn't exactly where he was supposed to be. Draper came in with a mandate to modernize, restructure, and cut costs. And from the moment he arrived, he and Robert Hayes did not speak the same language. It was not personal. Not at first. Robert pushed back on decisions he thought were strategically short-sighted. He raised concerns in meetings that Draper had already decided were settled. He advocated for his team when the restructuring conversations began to circle their department. He was not insubordinate. He was not hostile. He was exactly the kind of senior employee who is valuable in every organization and threatening in the wrong one. A man who knew too much, had too much credibility, and was too respected by the people beneath him for Draper to simply move around. So Draper moved against him instead. It did not happen overnight. That is important to understand. What happened to Robert Hayes was not a sudden act. It was a patient, methodical process. His performance reviews, which had been strong for 19 years, began to shift. Vague language appeared. Concerns about leadership approach. Questions about adaptability. None of it specific. None of it documented with anything that would hold up to scrutiny. But all of it building a paper trail. A quiet, carefully constructed case for what Draper had already decided. Robert noticed. He noticed when his name stopped appearing on the distribution list for executive briefings. He noticed when a project he had led for 2 years was quietly reassigned without conversation. He noticed when the mentor he had worked alongside for a decade, a senior vice president named Gary Caldwell, stopped initiating contact and started being unavailable. He noticed all of it. And he did what men of his generation and his character do when they sense the ground shifting beneath them. He worked harder. He documented his results more carefully. He came in earlier and stayed later. He believed, because everything in his life had taught him to believe this, that the work would speak for itself. That performance would win. That a man who had delivered for 22 years could not simply be erased. He was wrong. On the morning of October 14, 2009, Robert Hayes received a calendar invitation for what was described as a quarterly review with Human Resources. He had attended dozens of them. He dressed that morning the way he always dressed, jacket, tie, the kind of careful presentation that had become habit over 2 decades. He drove to the building, parked in his assigned space for the last time without knowing it, rode the elevator to the 31st floor, and walked into a conference room where 2 HR representatives, his direct supervisor, and an outside legal counsel he had never met were waiting. The moment he saw the attorney, he knew. You do not need anyone to explain that kind of room to you. Every man who has ever built something and had it taken away knows exactly what that room feels like the second you walk through the door. The air is different. The faces are arranged differently. And there is a document already on the table before you even sit down. They read from it. Performance concerns. Cultural alignment. A restructuring of the division. Language so deliberately vague it could have meant anything and was specifically designed to mean nothing he could challenge. 22 years. Reduced to 11 minutes and a severance agreement with a non-disparagement clause. He asked for specifics. They offered careful non-answers. He asked to see the supporting documentation. They cited HR policy. He asked for time to respond formally to the concerns. They slid the severance agreement closer and told him the decision had been finalized at the executive level. Sign here, Robert, and please return your badge on your way out. He walked back through the office to collect his things. And here is the part of this story that I want you to hold on to, because it is the part that reveals not just what happened to Robert Hayes, but what kind of people surrounded him. As he moved through that floor with his cardboard box, people looked. Some looked away quickly, the way people do when they are ashamed of themselves, but not quite enough to act differently. Some offered tight, uncomfortable smiles. And one man, a man Robert had brought into the company, trained from his first week, defended twice when others wanted him let go, passed him in the hallway, looked him up and down, and said 4 words.
Guess you were indispensable.
Robert did not respond. He picked up his box, walked to the elevator, and pressed the button for the parking garage. The doors closed behind him, and he sat in his car in that garage for 45 minutes. Not crying, not making calls, not sending angry emails. Just sitting, just deciding. Because in that moment, in that silence, Robert Hayes was making a choice that the people upstairs had not accounted for. They had calculated his finances. They had calculated the legal risk. They had calculated the professional impact. What they had not calculated was the particular quality of a man who has been told he is nothing and chooses, in that parking garage, in that silence, to treat that verdict as the opening argument in a much longer conversation. What came next was not immediate. And I want to be honest with you about that, because stories like this are often told as though the comeback is clean, as though the man who gets knocked down simply gets up, dusts himself off, and charges forward. That is not what happened to Robert Hayes. What happened to Robert Hayes was a darkness that lasted years. The severance covered him for a time. But at 54 years old, in an industry where word travels fast and reputations are managed carefully, re-entry proved harder than he had ever imagined. He applied to positions he was qualified for and heard nothing. He reached out to contacts who had attended his retirement parties for other people and suddenly found themselves too busy to return a call. He went on interviews where the conversations were polite and professional and went nowhere. The story being told about him, not loudly, not publicly, but in the way that professional narratives move through industries, quietly and efficiently, was not that Robert Hayes had been a victim of corporate politics. The story was that Robert Hayes had been a problem. Difficult. Past his time. A man who couldn't adapt. The industry he had given 2 decades to had closed its doors and dimmed its lights, and he was standing outside in the dark. His marriage, 31 years strong, was tested in ways neither he nor his wife Carol had been prepared for. Not because their bond was weak, but because watching a proud man lose his footing is its own kind of grief, and grief inside a marriage requires both people to carry something they did not sign up to carry. There were mornings Robert did not get up until noon. There were weeks where the home office he had set up with optimism sat and used while he sat in the living room watching the morning news with the sound of a man running out of forward momentum. He did not talk about it. Men of his generation, raised the way Robert was raised, were not taught to name this kind of pain. You did not sit across from someone and say, "I am losing myself." You did not say, "I built my entire identity around being capable, and now I do not know who I am." You absorbed it. You carried it. You got up the next day and tried again. And Robert Hayes tried again, every day, through 2 years of trying that produced very little. What changed was not a single moment. It never is. It was accumulation. It was his son, Marcus, who sat across from him one evening and said, "Dad, you built their company for 22 years. You know everything they know and more. Why are you trying to get back into a room that already showed you who it was? Build your own room." It was Carol who placed a legal pad in front of him one Saturday morning and said, "Stop applying to their world. Start building yours." It was Robert himself, alone in his car on a February morning in 2012, listening to the radio and hearing a business segment about a man in his 60s who had started a company after being passed over for corporate advancement his entire career and had built it into something that now employed over 200 people. Robert pulled over, sat in the parking lot of a grocery store, and wrote 4 pages of notes on the back of a gas station receipt. He knew supply chain management the way a craftsman knows his tools. He knew the inefficiencies, the pressure points, the places where large companies consistently lost money because they were too bureaucratic to move quickly. He knew the clients. He knew the language. He knew the problems. What he had never been allowed to do inside Hartwell Grayson, build the solutions on his own terms, he was now, for the first time in his professional life, completely free to do. He called his company RH Logistics Solutions. He registered it out of a spare bedroom. His first client was a regional food distribution company that needed help restructuring their routing systems. The contract was worth $11,000. For a man who had managed budgets in the tens of millions, $11,000 was a number that required a particular kind of humility to accept. Robert accepted it without hesitation. He delivered the work as though $11 million were on the line. He got a referral, then another. He brought on a part-time assistant in year 2, a full-time operations manager in year 3. By 2016, RH Logistics Solutions had 17 employees and was competing for, and winning, mid-sized contracts against firms with 10 times his infrastructure. By 2019, his annual revenue crossed a threshold that would have satisfied most men and told Robert Hayes there was still further to go. He had been building steadily, quietly, methodically, the way he had always worked, for 7 years when his assistant forwarded him a commercial real estate listing. A property in downtown Chicago, available for acquisition following a corporate restructuring. The address was in the subject line, and Robert looked at it for a long time before he said anything. It was the building. His attorney told him the decision was emotional and that emotional decisions in commercial real estate were how men lost money. His accountant ran the numbers and said the acquisition made financial sense. His wife sat across from him at the kitchen table the evening he told her and asked one question. She said, "Robert, is this about the business or is this about something else?" He thought about it honestly, the way Robert Hayes approached most things, and he said, "Carol, it is about both. And I think that is all right." The acquisition closed on a Wednesday morning in October of 2024. 15 years, almost to the week, from the morning he had carried that box through those doors. The wire transfer cleared at 9:47 a.m. Robert received the confirmation email, closed his laptop, and sat in his office, in his building, for a few minutes by himself. He did not throw a party. He did not post about it. He did not call anyone from that 31st floor to let them know. He took the elevator up, walked the hallways, stood at the window that looked out over the city, and took his time. Because he had earned the time. Because no one could take this floor from him. Because the view from up here looked exactly the same as it always had. And he was finally the one who owned it. The man who had said, "Guess you weren't indispensable," had been let go from Hartwell Grayson himself in a round of layoffs in 2015. He now worked for a smaller firm in the suburbs. Gary Caldwell, the mentor who had gone quiet, had reached out to Robert twice in recent years looking for consulting opportunities. Robert had responded professionally both times. He always did. Philip Draper, the COO who had orchestrated the paper trail and engineered the exit, had left Hartwell Grayson in 2017 under circumstances the company described publicly as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. Robert did not think about Philip Draper very often. He had found, over the years, that the men who tried to diminish you rarely deserve the space in your mind that anger wants to give them. Here is what I want to leave you with. Robert Hayes did not win because the universe corrected an injustice on his behalf. He did not win because karma operated on a schedule. He won because he refused, in that parking garage, in that silence, to accept the verdict. He won because he took everything they had tried to make worthless, his knowledge, his relationships, his 22 years of hard-earned understanding, and he built something of his own with it. He won because Carol put a legal pad in front of him, because his son told him to build his own room, because a voice on the radio reminded him that it was not too late, because when the $11,000 contract came in, he delivered it like a man who knew exactly who he was. There is a moment in every man's life when the world tells him the story is over, when the room is arranged against him and the document is already on the table and the people he trusted are suddenly unavailable. The question is not whether that moment will come. The question is what you decide, in the silence that follows, about what the next chapter is going to say. Robert Hayes decided in a parking garage, and 15 years later, he owned the building. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a Robert Hayes moment? Have you ever been handed that box, been called nothing, been written off by people who never understood what they were losing? Tell me about it in the comments. What did you do next? Because someone watching this right now needs to hear your story as much as they needed to hear his. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something, if it gave you something to hold on to, hit that like button. It tells us this kind of storytelling matters. Subscribe if you are not already here,